Welcome to the Money Insights Podcast, where high-income earners come to learn wealth-building strategies that will take them from high income to high net worth. With your hosts, financial and wealth-building experts, Christian Allen and Rod Zabriskie.
Welcome into another episode of the Money Insights Podcast, where we talk all things money and business. My name's Christian Allen, and I'm here with my co-host. You know him as Rod the Pod Zabriskie. Rod, I couldn't decide whether to go the full name or stop at Rod. And, anyway, we're going Rod the Pod Zabriskie today. Anyway,
Sweet.
What's up, Rod? How are you, man?
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you?
Good. I'm excited to jump on and have an interesting conversation about everybody's favorite topic.
Yeah, they've been clamoring for this one for years.
Clamoring to talk annuities revisited.
Yep.
Because we talked annuities not that long. I mean, I guess it's probably been a while ago. But,
maybe
but
6
a lot
months
of
ago.
things has changed. A lot of things are different. Okay, but before we do that, we have to announce the tickets for the virtual summit are on sale. So you can go to, Rod, I always forget this, mivirtualsummit.com.
That's it. Yep.
Holy Moses, I need to get that right. Okay, go to mivirtualsummit.com. You can get tickets. Early bird tickets are happening right now. They're going on through, what's our date? We plan through April 4th.
April 4th. Yep.
So when this comes out, there probably won't be a lot of time left.
Yeah, maybe like a day.
So anyway, we've got great speakers: Tom Wheelwright, Sharon Lecter, Buck Joffrey, Rod Zabriskie, Chris Larson, Adam Carroll, the whole bunch.
Yes.
So it's going to be fun. Okay, Rod, let's jump into our topic for today. We're talking annuities revisited. Okay, Rod, so the reason we're calling it annuities revisited is because when I look back on that initial annuities episode we did, I don't remember what we called it, but it was episode number
Annuities
62.
101. Yep.
Okay, we did Annuities 101.
Yep.
I felt like I was pretty negative overall toward annuities in general. And lots of things have changed. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that my view on that has changed, but I thought it was at least worth revisiting because of the difference in kind of the economics that we're dealing with.
Sure.
Think about, so that was like 30 episodes ago, which means interest rates were drastically different at that point in time, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Starting to rise, but certainly not where they are now.
Yeah. Okay. So, Rod, before the episode started, when we were talking, I promised to ask you a couple of questions that you're not prepared for. Because before we get into a lot of this really interesting stuff that Rod's done a lot of prep on, like we're going to talk about the practical use and implementation of how annuities can actually work. But before we do that, Rod, I have a couple questions that I think if I was sitting on the other side listening to this, I would be interested in hearing. Okay.
Yep.
So here's the question. First question. I feel like we've covered the annuity basics, but have we really covered the annuity fundamentals? Okay. Now you're thinking those are like the same word, right?
Yeah. Hit me with
but they're
what you
slightly different.
Okay.
They're slightly different, at least in my mind right now.
Okay.
So when I'm talking fundamentals, I'm talking the intricacies, or at least a little bit deeper on how an annuity works. So what I mean is what's driving the annuity and the rates specifically.
Okay.
So here's the question, Rod. Interest rates have changed and we know that. And so we know that there's like some correlation there, but what drives annuity rates both in the short and long term, and why are they so different today than what they were 6 months ago? And then maybe Rod, we can even jump into, we just checked it out and found like a 5-year one at 5.6%. And then the 7-year one was at like 4.7% or something like that. Right.
Yep.
So anyway, maybe we can, after you answer that initial question, we can talk about that as like a follow-up to understanding how it all works. So give us the fundamental concepts around how annuities are worked from like a return perspective.
Okay. Yeah. So you mentioned interest rates. So that obviously matters. Well, why does that matter? Because we're dealing with life insurance companies that are offering these annuities. And as we've talked about in the past, what do life insurance companies invest in most frequently?
Bonds.
Bonds. Yes. Okay.
Okay,
So
so that leads us to another question, Rod.
yeah,
Aren't the bonds like concerning right now? We just saw banks fail
it's a
with
great question.
bond issues.
And we are going to get into more detail on this, but here's what I can say right now.
Okay.
And it goes back to your question about like, well, why would the 5-year annuity offer a higher rate than the 7-year annuity, fixed
Because
annuity?
historically, that wouldn't be the case. It would be like
Right.
you lock it up longer, you get a higher return.
Yes. And what historically or what usually is the case in the bond world is the same as well. If you buy a short-term bond, you get a lower interest rate than you do if you buy a longer-term bond. Similar reason, right? If the company or the government has the money for longer, they're willing to give you a higher rate as a result. Well, it turns out because of like the weird thing that's going on with interest rates, the Fed raising rates as quickly as they're raising them, bond rates, they call it an inverted curve. Instead of having higher rates be the longer term, you actually would have a lower rate. So literally, if you bought a 10-year bond as compared to a 3-year bond, you're going to get a lower return with the 10-year bond than the shorter one. And why? Because, and this goes back to your point about the banks, weird things happen when there's a huge shift in interest rates as it relates to bond. And the worst direction that can go is if you buy a bond at a low rate and interest rates go up, the value of your bond just went down. There's an inverse relationship there. As interest rates go up, the value of the bond goes down. So Silicon Valley Bank, the reason they got into trouble is because they bought these bonds at whatever it was, 2%, and now it was at 4% when they're needing to sell them. And so they had to sell them at a huge discount, had huge losses on those dollars as a result. Now, if you keep the bond to maturity, then you're fine, right? You bought it at 2%, you get the 2% return every year for the whatever duration it is, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and you're fine. The reason they got into trouble is because they had to actually sell the bonds.
And they're selling them at a lower price, right?
Right.
Because they're discounted.
Huge discount.
Okay. So at a fundamental level, I think that gives us a good idea, right? Like, and like you said, going into this conversation around why they're offering. Okay, maybe just clarify this, Rod.
Mm-hmm.
Why, generally speaking, a longer term bond or a longer term annuity pays a higher interest rate, and why it's not happening today?
Yeah. So it's the what we call the time value of money, right? If I'm going to give you money, you say, "Hey, Rod, can you give me a loan?" And I say, "Okay, well, when are you going to be able to pay it back?" And you say in 6 months, then I might charge you a different rate than if you said I need to keep it for 10 years. Right. And that's basically what happens. So in a bond, let's just say it's a corporate bond. The company wants to build a new location or expand in some way. So they need to raise capital to do that. They'll do it through debt. So they offer this bond. Well, people who buy the bond, they're going to buy it for, X period of time. And the longer the company is saying they need to keep your money before they give it back to you, the higher rate, typically the higher interest rate they have to charge, or sorry, pay. On the company side, they're paying a higher interest rate to the bondholder the longer they're going to keep it. So that's generally the way it works, because in a more stable interest rate environment, you can more predictably anticipate what's going to happen. When you're in an environment where rates triple over the course of 8 months, then not so much, right? So then the shorter term stuff there, people are like, okay, well, are the companies or the government or whatever, whoever's offering the bond, are thinking, well, I know I can offer this at this rate today. I don't know so much what it's going to look like in 3 years, in 5 years, what interest rates will be, because we're just like in a crazy period right now. So that's why you have that inverted curve, and that just throws all kinds of different things out of whack.
Okay, thanks, Rod. I feel like that's helpful. That's
cool.
So we had to get to the fundamentals, right? Understand what's driving interest rates, because if there's any difference in opinion today, it would have to be because that core fundamental looks better than it did at that time. Because really, my problem with annuities at the time was, hey, if it just doesn't make sense to lock your money up at 2%, right? For any duration of time, most likely. I mean, you could make an argument, if you're gonna, your money's gonna sit in the bank for a year, that you put it in a CD or something. But like, aside from something like that, there's probably not a lot of reason to lock up your money at that kind of low interest rate.
Yeah.
Well, there could, however, be some real value in locking up money at higher interest rates. So it's an interesting, so right now we don't know what interest rates are going to look like in a year or 2 or 5. It's a little bit unpredictable, right? Like, could kind of go either way. But there is a real possibility that interest rates do start to go back down. And if that's the case, then the longer you've been able to lock in your 5.6% annuity, the happier you're going to be, at least with that money that you want to be like, safe money.
Yeah. And it obviously becomes very speculative, but if you think interest rates are going to go down, go buy bonds.
Fair point.
Right?
Fair point.
Because the reverse would happen from what we described earlier. You buy the bond now, the interest rates go down. Well, the value of your bond just went up. Because if someone's buying new bonds and they can go get it at 2%, or they can buy your bond at 4%, they have to pay more to get yours than to get, what they're paying on a new bond.
Okay. All right, Rod, let's jump into the practical side of annuities. Okay.
Let's do
it. Let's just kick it off, Rod. Who can benefit from annuities? And I have to say, Rod put together this outline, and it's very detailed. He tends to do that. So, Rod, I'm going to do my best to keep the flow going while we make sure we hit on all the important points. Does that sound fair?
Yep. That sounds
okay.
Good.
But I like it. This first part, I'll take the first part and kind of get us going. And then, because it's going to get more detailed and you're going to need to jump in. Okay. So here we go. Who can benefit from annuities? Rod's suggesting 3 groups of people. The first one would be people looking for guaranteed cash flow in retirement. Okay. The second one would be people looking for protected growth. And when you say protected growth, you mean you're looking for accumulation, but you're not willing to put it at the principal at risk.
Yeah. You don't like the volatility of the market or the risk in other places. And so this can give you some upside potential, but protected on the downside.
Okay. And specifically there, we're talking I guess it doesn't matter whether we're talking indexed annuities or fixed. Now we should clarify, we aren't talking variable annuities.
Yeah. We'll bring it up here in a short moment here while we're talking for context, but yeah, we're pretty much talking about fixed. And in this case, the protected growth side, it's the indexed annuities is what's
there are a few places where I believe a variable annuity can make sense, but most of the time, if you're going to invest in the market, my belief is that there are times that it can make sense. Again, specifically if you look at it as a potential retirement income play or something like that, I can see places where there could create value. So I don't want to even suggest that there's no opportunity there. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about those 3 items, Rod. Guaranteed cash flow in retirement, protected growth, and then the third one was asset-based long-term care. So tell me this, why are those the 3? And are you challenging me to see if I can come up with any additional ones?
if you have anything else, that's great. But really, I just think through the way the conversations have gone with people in the past, and really these are generally the directions we're going. If someone is looking for any of these 3 items, then annuities are at least something we have on the table we're considering as potentially offering.
Okay. And I agree with it. As I was thinking about situations, you did a pretty good job of being broad enough that you could probably stick any strategic way of using it would probably go into one of those 3 buckets.
I hope so.
Okay.
And we'll get into more of those kind of different branches that can come off of those as well.
Okay, well, let's start at the top then. Guaranteed cash flow in retirement. What do you mean when we say that?
Okay, so we'll actually get into more detail on that.
Okay.
I did throw a little extra piece in here because I wanted to make sure there's clarity between qualified money versus non-qualified money.
That's important.
Because in any of these that we're going to talk about, you can use both. But there are some nuanced differences if you do. So I figured let's hit on that first. And then as we get into the different implementation, then if you're thinking about qualified funds, you at least have some context, or non-qualified.
Okay, Rod, let's start by defining qualified versus non-qualified. It's super important, right? So talk about what the difference is and how someone would know the difference.
Okay, yeah. So qualified basically just means it's inside of a retirement wrapper. 401k, 403b, 457, TSA, IRA, any of those things are what we're calling qualified. It was pre-tax going in. Later on, when you take money out, it's going to be taxed at ordinary income rates. And so when you take any of that money and you put it into an annuity, and actually I'll say this, like a 457, it is an annuity inside of a qualified plan with an employer, usually a government entity. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about moving qualified money into an annuity, it keeps its IRA wrapper, stays qualified money, because it's not considered a distribution. It's just a transfer into another qualified account. But then later on, when you do take distributions, whether you're just taking withdrawals or whether you're taking it as income, that all that money, when it comes back out, is going to come out at the ordinary income rates.
Okay. So there's a couple of things to keep in mind, right? Actually go into non-qual first.
Okay.
Let's talk about the rules. Let's just knock all of it out.
Yeah. So an interesting thing happens when you have money that was not in a retirement account before it comes in. It's after tax, sitting in a brokerage account or a CD or something else, and you're saying, well, instead I want to now move it into an annuity because I want some of these benefits we're going to talk about. Well, it's not an IRA because it's not qualified money. What's interesting though is the IRS has called annuities kind of like a semi-retirement account, right? So because it is retirement money, it's intended to be retirement money because it's an annuity. So it takes on, for example, the 59.5 rule. If I put the money in and I'm only 30 years old, and I need to not plan on using that money until I'm 59.5. I've now put it into a retirement account, again, a semi-retirement account, because it now is subject to that 59.5 rule. Okay. Which means that it grows tax deferred. All the growth that I get, I'm not going to 1099 at the end of each year. But when I do take money out, then I'll pay tax. I have to take its life, last in, first out. The interest or the growth that I've had in the account is the money I'm taking out first. I'm fully taxed on that. If I've taken all that out and now I'm tapping back into my basis or the money I put in, I'm not going to be taxed on that because I already paid tax on that before I put it in, right?
Yep. And it is ordinary income tax rates.
Correct. Yep.
So not capital gains rates.
Yeah. But it's not a traditional retirement because I'm not going to have like RMDs or something. If I get to 72 and I haven't taken the money out, they're going to not going to force me to start taking it out. So it's, again, semi-retirement account status.
Yeah. I think that's a fair way to put it.
Okay.
Okay. So I think that establishes it. Basically, we're talking about money that's in an IRA wrapper. That's your qualified money. If it's not, it's non-qualified money.
Yep.
Okay. And there are some slight differences like you've talked about. We can get into those in other places. As we're talking about strategies, we can hit on, again, why that status of being qualified or non-qualified ends up being so important. Like you said, you don't want to be the 32-year-old who might be excited because you're seeing, a 5 or 6% fixed interest rate annuity. You're like, I'll just throw, some extra cash there. And then you realize that, I can't get back at it without a 10% penalty.
Yep.
Well, you don't want to do that.
Yep.
So we want to be smart about it. Okay. So Rod, let's get into the first thing. And that is how to create guaranteed cash flow in retirement. That was one of our kind of core things. So let's dive into how we actually do it.
Yeah. And the context for this is we also did an episode where we talked about retirement cash flow. And one of the things that we suggested is for some people, they like the idea of creating some level of guaranteed income, right? To cover their just maybe basic expenses, so that the maybe cash flow coming off of their other investments or other things they're doing can take care of the more lifestyle things, but they want to make sure that at the very least they have guaranteed income to cover those basics. So an annuity is a great way, and really one of the only ways on a guaranteed basis. Like you have pensions and other things like that are usually outside of your control. But as an individual, if I'm saying I want to create my own guaranteed income, then really an annuity is the place I'm going to go to do that.
Yeah. Because again, like there's other things I can do to create a cash flow, right? But they're not necessarily guaranteed. They might be strong and steady and have like, if I go get a real estate property that can create cash flow, but it is not the same. And this one is defined and meant to, well, in this example, right, it's meant to produce income that you can't outlive.
Yep, exactly. And then, so now how do we define outlive? That may seem pretty simple, but for a married couple, it becomes something you have to consider, because an annuity can be set up for an individual, for that individual's life. So when the income is guaranteed to pay out, when that individual passes away, then the income stops. Or you can set it up as what they call joint, so that it's for both, and the income continues until the second person passes away.
Yeah, and of course, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, as you may imagine,
I think I jumped the gun.
No, yeah, you can get more income if it's the single life, but if I choose that, then Jody's really not going to like me very much if I pass away before she does, and the income stops, unless we made other plans to make
there you go. That was a good caveat, because I think that is important. There's certainly opportunities to plan, and you might have some assets that are meant for one, and we talk about using life insurance as a way to plan for that. But it's not the only way, right?
Sure.
You could decide that, hey, we've as a couple determined that we want to maximize the income coming from this place, and this other asset is deemed, that's going to come in and replace the income that might have been lost. So there's other ways to do it, but life insurance is kind of an obvious one, because obviously once the person dies, the money then kicks in and replaces that. So,
right. Yep.
Okay. And we can talk more about that. Okay. So single life, joint life. Rod, talk about these weird acronyms, SPIA, DIA. Gosh, I'm like hesitant to even say that. But anyway, they're SPIA, it's SPIA, and then the DIA is DIA. Talk about those.
Yeah. So those are what are called, SPIA stands for single premium immediate annuity. You're taking a lump sum of money, giving it to the insurance company in exchange for a guaranteed income stream. Okay. The asset went away. That lump sum of money no longer exists in your world, has no value to you except in the form of that guaranteed income coming to you. DIA is very similar. It's just called a deferred income annuity, where you're saying, hey, I'm going to take this lump sum of money. I know I want it to create income, but I just don't need it now. It's not an immediate thing. It's going to be 2, 5, 10 years in the future that I'm going to ask the insurance company to turn on that income, but I'm giving them the lump sum now.
Why in the world would I do that, Rod?
It's going to be product specific, but by waiting, the insurance company is going to offer you higher amounts of income than they would if you were saying, hey, I need the income to start now.
Yep. And then, and I say the nice thing, and I think this is true, like there's good reasons to use most products that are out there. They're just kind of specific, right? So in a situation like that, if you felt like it was really valuable to know exactly what the number is going to be, that's the value you get from a deal. I can actually make a deal today to determine what income stream I'm going to get at a future point. So it's not like it just grows in the market, or even that they necessarily assign an interest rate to it. Normally, that's more that they're assigning an income value that exists at the time that you decide to take it.
Yep.
Now, so for somebody that is really looking for certainty now and in the future, that could be a valuable opportunity.
Yep.
Okay, so single premium immediate annuity, that's our SPIA. The deferred income annuity, that's our DIA. And both of those, again, are like your typical, when you think of annuities, it's just you give the insurance company a lump sum of money. they pay you out a guaranteed income stream for a period of time or life or whatever, which you're going to get into. That's what DIAs and SPIAs are.
Yeah.
Okay.
And when it's for a period of time, they call that period certain. So for example, if I said, hey, I'm giving you this lump sum of money, it goes away, but I'm getting this income, but I don't want to just like be totally out of that and disinherit my spouse or my kids if I die like next year. So what often happens is they'll say 10 years certain or 15 years certain with life income, so that it's, if I live past the 10-year certain, income's going to continue for as long as I live till I die. But if I die sooner, then I at least know someone's getting money for that specified period of time. It's not just all going away.
Okay. And again, like you said, at least that we're aware of, this is the only way to accomplish that kind of like specific objective, right?
Yeah.
So it's unique in that way.
Yeah. And it's also fair to say that it's the way to create the highest income as a percentage of that initial asset that I'm kind of turning over to the insurance company. In other words, when you look at the actual payout rates of those, they might say, hey, if you give us the 100,000 today and you say you want 10 years certain, but income for life, then they might say, well, we'll give you a 10% payout rate or a 9.9% payout rate. Whereas if we talk about some of these other options, it might be more like a 5 or a 6% payout rate, which is a huge difference, right?
Yeah.
So it's the highest way to create the most income based on the initial asset.
And again, on a guaranteed basis, because there's lots of ways to create cash flow and other assets, but specifically in this world. Okay.
Great point.
Okay. Perfect. So now we're going to jump into this conversation around index, variable annuity, income riders. Where do you want to take it?
Yeah. So now we're talking about an asset that is yours, but it's now sitting inside of this annuity, and it has an income rider attached to it. An income rider just meaning that you have the ability at some point in time to turn on a guaranteed stream of income. You don't have to necessarily start that now, but you could use this type of a vehicle and still create income immediately. But
Rod, I just thought of
most cases, we're waiting. Yeah.
I think we need to clarify this. Okay. So we talked about the single premium immediate annuity and the deferred income annuity. And now we're moving away from immediate income or definitive income products.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
I think that's important. Okay, Rod, one thing I think that would be helpful to clarify as we jump into this conversation around index and variable annuities is that we're now moving from income annuities specific to what we call deferred annuities, which just means that there's likely a deferred time frame. Now, I say that, and D is kind of a funny one because it's both deferred and an income, but it's one that you hand over the money and it's gone.
Correct.
Now we're talking about when you put money in, you still own the underlying asset. And that's probably the biggest delineation difference between direct income and or when we go to deferred annuities. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, exactly. And there are several reasons that's important. The biggest thing is that, yes, it's still your money sitting in an account and it's still yours, right? And then when you defer, or if you decided to access a part of it before you start taking the actual guaranteed income, et cetera, all of those are options. Or if you die in the shorter term rather than longer term, then in the earlier example, I was saying that they will guarantee this payout for the 10 years or 15 years or whatever the period certain was. In this case, the asset still exists in your own account. So your heirs inherit the cash that's still sitting there. There's no like income implied there. It's just an asset that's there. They inherit the asset.
Yep. And again, super important. There's a big difference between those two.
Yeah. And so now as we delineate the purpose behind the annuity, what we're going to do is right now talk about why or how someone uses a deferred annuity to create guaranteed streams of income. And then in a minute, we'll contrast that with someone who isn't necessarily looking for income. It's more about appreciation. And then third is the long-term care based asset. So in the rest of our conversation, we are talking specifically about this type of a deferred annuity and no longer going to do anything with the SPIA, pure income type of annuity.
Okay. And again, like we could talk about, there are some strategies where those could make sense, but they're kind of less common that those come up. So if when we spend time working with people in the retirement income space, while those exist and can be utilized, more often than not, we're going to lean toward using this other, just because, once you give up the asset and those are gone. And over here, we have a lot more optionality, if that's a word. We have more flexibility. And again, maybe most importantly, we own the underlying asset regardless. So for those reasons, we're going to spend more time getting into strategies around indexed annuities specifically.
Correct. Yep. And I did include variable annuities because, again, if you're looking specifically at the income rider, then there could be some reasons
similar
to choose a variable annuity. And really it just goes down to the product. And we'll talk in a minute about kind of some of the product variations and why someone might choose one versus another. But getting back to the core, with the income rider attached, we are in a situation where we can create a guaranteed income for life. So we're still in that category, this first category of how to create guaranteed cash flow in retirement. Using this kind of an income rider is a great way to do that.
Well, and I think it's worth considering because, over the almost 20 years that I've been doing this, there's been times where I've seen index products that are performing better, but there's been times when I've seen variable products that are actually performing specifically as it relates to that income rider piece.
Yes.
So, and the other thing is they oftentimes will have different goals and objectives, right? So I may be able to get something in the variable annuity from an income perspective that they're not offering in the indexed annuity space that I really like. And that might be the reason that I choose one or the other. But those are all the things to put out there. And I think the biggest thing is that if we're being fair and trying to be, what's the objective, you should be looking at both of them.
Yeah, because it's just looking at the options and picking the one that you like best. Now, when you do get to a place where you're starting to turn that income on, and again, whether it's right away or waiting 5 or 10 years before you start that income, when you do start drawing on that income, it is drawing out of your account value. So to use an example, let's say I put 500,000 into it. I waited 10 years before I was ready to start taking the income. Now it's worth $1 million. And I'm taking whatever, $60,000 a year of guaranteed income. Then that 60,000 is actually coming out of my $1 million account base. Right. Yeah. So if I were to draw that down to where my account value actually does go to zero, obviously it would take several years before that happens, right? I'd have to live another, 20 years or something before that happens. But once that does go down to zero, the income is still guaranteed. At that point in time, if I die or when I die, there's no inheritance for my kids because the actual asset I've depleted it. But the income is guaranteed to last the rest of my life and or my wife's life if we did the joint, right? So I think that's really critical to understand.
Okay. So I think we've got the core stuff down. What else do we want to talk about as it relates to income?
Yeah, we talked about that there are product variations on how the income gets created, and we're not going to get into like specific products of product A versus product B or whatever.
Yeah, there's too many of them, first of all. And they can be quite complex, right? So like if we were doing it would take us hours to do one of those and it would be really boring.
Right.
So yeah, we were not going to do that, but we are going to talk about the core of what they are and the differences.
Yep. And I'm basically going to put it into two differentiators. The first one is when do you want to start income? Because if you want to start income immediately, there will be certain products that are better suited for starting that income right now, as compared to other products that are designed and better suited for deferring income. And then how long am I going to defer it? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Again, I don't have to necessarily decide exactly when I'm going to take income, but if I have an idea, that will lead me to products that are going to be more favorable for a 5-year deferral versus a 10-year deferral or whatever.
Rod, why do you think there's so much variation from, I mean, and I have some ideas on this too, but why do you think there's so much variation in what happens from product to product, company to company? Because I can tell you from, being in the space, like it absolutely is something you need to shop. Like you have to look at the options and they change. But anyway, from your perspective, why do we see that out there?
Yeah, I think part of it has to do with companies wanting to set themselves apart, be a little bit different. And a lot of them are pretty vanilla, are pretty similar, but there are a couple of companies out there, especially that are pretty creative, pretty innovative in the way that they set them up. So I think that becomes one point. And then maybe the second one is that just, demand, like clients or potential clients are looking at the product offerings and they're saying, oh, it's not quite hitting the mark. If it did this or if it did that, then I would be more interested. And so the the products that were offered stay on the table because there are people who like those, but then as they offer additional products, I think just over time it's just branched into so many different directions, and categorically they may all be similar, but with just differences, nuanced differences from one company, one product to the other.
Yeah, and it is really interesting. Like like I say, there's pretty drastic differences depending on what you're looking for. And I think the product design, like that's a big part of it, right? So you talked about the companies that want to differentiate themselves. I think that absolutely is a component. And then in addition to that, this is a really interesting thing. Most people don't know that insurance companies know going into the year how much they want to sell.
Yeah.
Okay, so most people would assume like company A just wants to sell as much as they possibly can of any product they can, right? If they can get it out there and it's appropriate for the customer or the client, then great. That's actually not how it works. They will be a lot more calculated in how that works, right? So it might be that I create a product that's meant to do ABC. It's really meant to focus on inflation adjusted income, right?
Yeah.
But they want to make sure that their exposure to that is only so high. So what ends up happening is they basically put it out there with an idea, a general idea of how much they're willing and wanting to sell of that product. And then going into the year, there's probably places where obviously where they're excited to go above. But my point here is just that there's a lot of risk calculation that's happening both on the front end and on the back end. And I think all of these reasons that we talked about are reasons as to why there's just huge variation. But again, the core of what you need to know as a consumer is that you need to shop the companies, because the goal that you're looking to accomplish could have 3 or 4 different companies that do it relatively well, but at the given moment, one might be better than the other.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. And we do that every time. So like it could be a week later that a person comes in with the same goals and objectives, and we're still going to go check the product and make sure that the product we used a week earlier was still fitting and making sense.
Yeah, and still the best option, because there could be another company in the meantime that came up with a different variation, or like you said, by volume, they want to incentivize people more so now than they thought they needed to a week ago to move the product.
Yeah, that's another one. That's a good point. They create incentives both for the consumers, right? Sometimes they'll add a little bonus, but they'll also create incentives for the agents. Right? If they need to or want to sell more of a certain product.
Yep.
So it's interesting.
Okay, so that's the first. So we talked about the one differentiator being when you want to start income will determine product. The second one is how you want the income value to grow. What I mean by this is a lot of these companies you'll have the underlying account value. So I talked about the example, you put the 500,000 in, and based on what's happening in the index or the market, depending on if it's indexed annuity versus variable annuity, then the actual account value will change over time. But then they'll have a separate measure value that they measure inside of it. They call it the income value. And that is separate from the account value. It's not actual real dollars out there that are that you could go and access, but it's a value that they're using to calculate the income that you are able to get later when you're ready to turn it on. And a couple of examples are, some annuities might say, well, we'll give you a X% increase every year on your income value, regardless of what happens in your actual account value. So at that 500,000, they say, we'll give you a 10% increase on your income value for every year you defer and wait to take that income. And then they might define it and say that's 10% simple. That's, in most cases, that's going to be simple, but in some cases it is compounded. So if it's simple, that they're just saying for every year you defer, we'll give you a 50, in my example, if you have 500,000 going in, we'll give you a $50,000 increase on your income value for every year you defer. But then there's usually a cap on that as well. So I mentioned earlier, if you know you're going to most likely wait for 5 years versus 10 years, you can get products that are more specific to that, because at the end of the 5 years, they might say, we're no longer giving you that increase, or 10 years or whatever it is. So,
Rod, can I just tell you, this concept has confused a lot of people.
Yeah.
Okay, so I understand the reason why it's done.
Mm-hmm.
Being around it and understanding like the nuanced differences that we can create by having that separation. But can I just tell you, like, I can't tell you the number of people over the years that have been like, well, I have a 10% guarantee. And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, you have a 10% guarantee on an income value that's like, it's so drastically different. And then when people,
Right.
what happens so often is when people hear that and they're like, they find out from another agent or someone that didn't sell it to them that, oh, this is not what I thought it was. So
Mm-hmm.
can I just tell everybody, like, annuities, indexed annuities, variable annuities, they're relatively complex. You've got to make sure you understand them, because sadly, that's fooled a lot of people into thinking they had something that they did not.
Yep, it's true.
On the other hand, it can be powerful if you're buying it and you know what you're getting. That could still be really like a really great deal. You just have to know that that's what's happening.
Yes. Yep. Exactly.
Okay, there's
So
my
no, I think it's a great
consumer
show.
warning. My consumer warning.
Absolutely. Good. And then one other variation on that. So I talked about a simpler compounded, like set interest increase that you get on that income value. The other way that they'll often do it is based on the performance of the index. If the index is performing better than your amount of income, well, the amount in your income value, right, goes up accordingly. But again, it's tied to the performance of the index instead of this kind of like straight line increase, like I described a minute ago.
Yeah. So there's various ways. And so what ends up happening is you kind of have to go make some educated guesses on how you think the market will perform.
Mm-hmm.
And that's difficult. So, but all I know is that for the right people, there's tremendous value in being able to have a guaranteed income without having to give up the underlying value, because that's scary, right? That just is hard to do.
Yep.
I mean, maybe not always, right? There's situations where it just makes a ton of sense, but for most people, it's really difficult to just give the money away. Whereas this gives you the option to say like, hey, I could use the underlying value, or I could use this income value. I've got the choice.
Yep.
I'm paying something for that income value,
Yes.
but it still provides a value that gives me, maybe it's peace of mind or something like that.
Yeah.
And then we're going to talk about next, the situation where people don't want anything to do with the income riders.
Yeah.
Right.
Not worried about it at all. Yeah. But I'm glad you said that last point, because those income riders, I mean, I hate to say always, but pretty much always come with a cost. If you want that guaranteed income rider on your policy, and from day one, you're going to pay a fee to have it there. So
yep. That's
understand what that is as well.
Yeah. And those are wildly different too.
Yep.
Right. One of the reasons that variable annuities have gotten a bad name in the past is because they have a tendency to end up being higher priced. They aren't all that way,
Mhm.
and they can be done. It can be done relatively well, but and the same thing applies though to index annuities. There's
Mhm.
some that I've seen that are just like outrageous, and I can't figure out how anyone could ever sell it.
Mhm.
And I don't even understand why the insurance companies are offering it. So
Yeah.
anyway, make sure you're thoughtful in that.
Yep. Good. Okay. If the next two, we're going to be a little more simple. So they're just more straightforward. There aren't as many moving parts like all these things we had to talk about on the income riders. So
Okay, so let's dive into it, Rod.
yeah.
How to use annuities for what we're calling protected growth.
Yep.
So now we're not worried necessarily about the income specifically. We just want our money to grow, we want it to accumulate value, but we don't want to leave it exposed to losses.
Yeah. Yeah, because this is a situation someone comes and they said, well, I'm worried about those things. Maybe it's currently in the market, especially for those qualified accounts when it was in the 401k or whatever. Pretty much all of them are invested in the market. You just kind of take that on. And when
Yep.
people, it's kind of put on their own to decide what they want to do with it. A lot of people say, well, I don't want to keep it as exposed, like you said, to that. Are there other options? And that's when often an indexed annuity comes into play for that type of person. So just to really quickly recap how index annuities work, there's a specific market index associated with it. So let's just again say it's the S&P 500. And in a year where the S&P is up, you'll participate in a portion of the growth. In a year where the index is down, you don't participate in the losses. You don't earn any interest in that year, but you don't participate in the losses. And there are a few different ways how they measure how much upside potential you have. Often they use caps. So it might be S&P 500. And this was Christian's favorite. 2 years ago, the cap on the S&P might have been like 2.5% or something, right?
Yeah, and I just thought, who in the world is buying that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, someone wants.
So in the case where we were using annuities, while interest rates were low, we were instead using stuff like what they call a participation rate. So it says, well, of what the S&P does or of whatever the index does, you participate in X percentage of it. And if it was the S&P, it might have been like 40% when interest rates were low. Now you might be up more into the 60, 70, 80%. Or if it's some of these other types of indexes, you might actually be above 100%. They might say, well, you're using this, they call it a volatility controlled index. It's not the same as investing in like the S&P. You're not going to have as much upside potential, but that's why when it comes to participation rate, they'll give you 140% or something like that. So
Yeah, they're not expecting it to get 30% return and you to get okay.
right.
Can I also just say this, like, as we're getting into this now this changes. We used to tell people, well, it just depends on the interest rate time frame.
Mhm.
But I would say right now, you probably are going into an indexed annuity with like a 5 to 8% return profile, right? So
Yep.
you're not going in there. If you're expecting it to get 20, probably not the right place to go.
Yeah.
While I've seen some indexed annuities do really well and have double-digit returns, I wouldn't go in there with that expectation. 5 to 8. That's my number. What do you think, Rod? Is
Yeah.
that
Well, I
fair?
know and there's a reason for that, because what's interesting is we might show someone annuity today, and when they say, hey, based on where the cap or the participation rate is right now, worst case historically you could have done was 9% or something like that, right? And so then someone might say, well, if the worst case historically was 9%, then how come you're telling me still expect 5 to 8? Well, if interest rates go down again, your caps and your participation rates are going to go down again. So 9% based on what interest rates are doing now is obviously realistic, and especially in that example, if the historical is that's your low point. But knowing the way things work and having seen a decade long period where interest rates were really low, you have to realize that those caps and participation rates do go down as interest rates go down. So
And again, there's the possibility that doesn't happen and interest rates stay
sure.
higher for longer,
Mhm.
and then the return profile could end up being higher. But again, usually if you're going into annuities in general, they're a more conservative vehicle. So like, you're not going in there trying to drive massive returns. You're going in there maybe first and foremost for the protection, and secondarily for the growth aspect.
Yep, for sure.
Okay. Rod, what other components do we need to talk about as it relates to just using simple growth annuities, index annuity? Talk about the most important components.
Yeah. So the idea on this one is I'm putting the 500,000 or whatever I'm putting into it, and I want it to grow in a protected way. I want to also have some access to it, so when I'm ready to use it, I'm going to be able to access it. So, and I want it to be pretty lean. So the nice thing about approaching an indexed annuity in this way is, in most cases, you can get it without any additional fees. We talked about fees on the income rider. That's true. But usually when you look at just the base account itself, they don't have additional fees associated with it. Now, the thing that you do need to realize, and I think we talked about this in our 101, but is vital here, when you access it, you have access to up to 10% per year of what they call a free withdrawal. If you access more than that, then you'll start to get into some surrender penalties, which are higher in the early years, go down as time goes on. So again, if you're putting it in there and expecting that you're going to need to access large amounts of it, especially in the shorter term, then an annuity would not be appropriate for that situation.
Okay. And you know what's interesting, Rod? This is probably where annuities have primarily gotten their bad name. Now, I'm not saying that annuities are bad. I'm just saying that if you type in annuities, you're going to see a lot of people who have negative things to say. Most of them are coming from Fisher Investments, but there's still a lot of negativity out there around annuities. And I think the reason is because they could just be improperly used, right? For these couple of things that we've talked about. If you've got limited liquidity, then you've got to make sure you're planning appropriately, right? And then the combination of that and working primarily with older people, and there being this kind of problem with elder abuse, I think those are probably the things that have given the overall, idea of annuities a bad name. But if we look at the core of what they are and understand it and do our due diligence, they can be, a vital piece in an overall strategic retirement cash flow plan.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, I have one more just caution, or there's something for people to be aware of. And this is the payoff when we talked earlier about how bonds are involved with this and why interest rates, impacted, etc. There's this little thing called the market value adjustment, just to be aware of. Okay. And essentially what it does is, again, we talked earlier, if you take more than 10% of withdrawal in the early years, then you have this additional surrender charge that goes with it, right? In that same scenario, you're taking more than 10% is where this market value adjustment could come in as well. Because if the interest rates at the time you're taking that money out are higher than the time when you put the money into the annuity, then you could also have an adjustment, pay an additional penalty, so to speak, because of what we talked about earlier. In other words, you put the money into the annuity, the insurance company went out and bought bonds. But if interest rates have gone up significantly and you're forcing them into a position where they have to sell bonds to get money back to you, which is basically what's happening when you go above that 10% free withdrawal amount, then you have to bear the burden of the loss of value there, right?
Okay, so here's the question, Rod. Can that work both ways?
Yes, it does.
I've seen it. I inherited a book of business that had at least, a handful of these market value adjustment annuities
that worked in their favor.
That were in the favor of the annuitant, who then got more than they actually expected.
Yeah, and it made sense to actually surrender the policy, the account early to take advantage of that, and then move that. Basically, the equivalent, like I talked earlier about that. If you buy bonds now and you think interest rates are going to go down, it's because you want to sell them and get a profit. Well, the same thing happened in that example with those. So,
okay, Rod, let's talk about how to use annuities in conjunction with long-term care.
Yeah,
that's our third topic of the place that we feel like annuities can be useful. And can I just tell you, I just thought of a couple other places where annuities could be useful.
Okay.
But they, as I think about it, they still fit into like accumulation, or what was our other one
income.
or income.
Yeah.
But I can think about, some stuff in the charitable planning world, but
Sure.
again, they're going to be used for either income. Anyway, so I think
Inside
it
of
still
those.
works. I'm trying to bust I'm like trying to bust it, but it's just not working. So
All right. Keep
I
thinking.
apologize, Rod. Let's go into the third one, which is how to use annuities for long-term care purposes.
Yeah. So long-term care, you have traditional long-term care insurance. We often talk about how you have long-term care riders on life insurance. Well, you can also have long-term care riders inside of an annuity. They call it an asset-based long-term care solution. And usually this just comes into place, especially for somebody who maybe they're too old at the time where they're starting to really think about long-term care. They can't get the traditional insurance. It would be just way too expensive. It's maybe the ship has sailed in terms of doing much with it in terms of the life insurance based type of rider.
Okay, so you've got someone who's older and unhealthy, and you're saying they can't qualify or not
Mhm,
healthy enough to qualify for life insurance at a favorable enough rate.
mhm.
Therefore, they could use this annuity long-term care combo as a way to support. Okay, so how
Right.
does that work, Rod?
Yeah, so you put the money into the annuity, and also I'll say this too, it can be qualified money to go in here. So maybe if you didn't have a bunch of non-qualified money to use in the life insurance side, but this, then asset based. Okay, so you put your lump sum in. The actual growth that they're going to give you on that account is minimal. Like they might be like 1-2%, something like that. So don't plan on the actual account value growing very
That's
robustly.
not its purpose.
Right. But what they do is they give you kind of a bonus towards the long-term care value. And we talked earlier about the idea of an income value that's measured separately than the actual account value. A similar thing is happening here. To the amount of money you can receive towards your long-term care, there's this separate long-term care value that is being calculated. And the longer you defer before you need to tap into it, the higher it can go. And usually, most products, there's a cap, typically 200 to 400% of what the initial deposit was that will go towards that long-term care value, which is real dollars now. It would come back to you in the case that you need the long-term care. The qualifying factors are the same as you would on your traditional long-term care. It's any two of the 6 activities of daily living. The 6 activities are things like bathing and dressing and being able to get in and out of bed and eating and all that kind of stuff. Or a cognitive impairment would be a second way to qualify for the benefit.
I'm trying to think of what the benefit, like why, when, in what situation might someone feel like that's a good pay. Okay, so here's one comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
One of the benefits here is that there is a differentiator between the two values, like you mentioned. We've got a long-term care value and we've got an actual value. So if I'm not as concerned about income necessarily, but I don't want to lose the money, right? I don't want to hand it over, or I don't want to even, I may just choose to do something like this instead of paying the premiums on a policy that even if I could qualify,
Sure.
right? Just because I like the idea that I'm not losing money here, even if I don't use the long-term care benefit, I at least have my cash. It may not have grown a lot, but at least I have, my cash plus a little bit of interest.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And when it comes time to pay out, there are two kind of variations, again, difference from product to product. They call it a per diem, which just means it's again like traditional long-term care where they say, hey, you'll get X amount of benefit per month that you're using it and qualify for it. Or there may be another variation where it's kind of like access as needed instead of the per diem. This one's not as common, but there are some products where you can get that. So,
okay, Rod, to cap things off, we are going to talk about a bonus item, and you've qualified it as, is an intentional mech better? Okay, so is a mech better? Well, first of all, what the heck is a mech? I mean, most people listening probably know. Modified endowment contract. Basically, what we're doing is we're saying is using life insurance in mech form more impactful, or can it be more impactful than using an annuity? And I guess the first question, Rod, is they're totally different. So explain to me why you would even consider, putting them side by side.
The IRS helps us do that initially, because if a life insurance policy becomes a MEC, then it is
Basically
considered an annuity. Yep. In a lot of different ways. The 59.5 rule applies. If your policy becomes a MEC, all of a sudden, if you try to take money out of it before 59.5, you're going to get that 10% penalty. But it also is taxed like an annuity. In other words, the kind of that non-qualified annuity that we talked about earlier, you were putting after-tax dollars into the life insurance policy to begin with. If it becomes a MEC, you still get that deferral of taxes. You're not getting a 1099 each year as the account grows. But then when you start to take the money out in traditional life insurance policies, we talk about taking money out on a tax-free basis. But if it becomes a MEC, when you start taking that money back out, you get taxed on the growth. You're taking the growth out first before you start tapping into your basis. Again, the same way we described earlier on the way the non-qualified annuity works.
So, okay. So then we've got, okay, maybe you should play it out, Rod. Why don't you show us what happens when I've got $100,000 and I'm considering putting it in one or the other. What does it look like in kind of that head-to-head matchup?
Yeah. So we just talked about the ways that they're similar. A MEC is similar to an annuity. Let's talk about the ways that they're different. With a MEC, you don't have that 10% withdrawal period, right?
Yep.
Or for that matter, the surrender period, right?
Yep.
Again, we're assuming this is a MEC, like a whole life MEC that doesn't have surrender charges, right?
Yeah. So there's a lot more. Initially, there's a lot more flexibility, right?
Liquidity.
Okay. And by the way, a lot of people don't even know you can do it, and a lot of insurance companies don't do it, but some do.
Correct. Yep. So, and most of the time, we and other agents will say, "Hey, we want to avoid a MEC." Well, the reason I put intentional in there is I'm saying, hey, sometimes it could make sense to set up a life insurance policy with a single lump sum up front, intentionally creating that MEC, because you capture some of these benefits, specifically as we talk about the second kind of category we're talking about of how to use an annuity for protected growth. Well, if it's in that kind of a whole life policy and it's max, I mean, we have to talk about max overfunded. This is like more than max overfunded, because we just blew past the MEC line. And there's very little pure insurance associated with this account that has a whole bunch of money sitting in it. Now it's earning that guaranteed interest rate and the dividend on that full amount that's sitting in the cash value.
So what ends up being really cool is that many times, because we're just utilizing the same growth mechanisms that we have in life insurance, which especially over the last decade have been far superior to what we've seen in annuities, it's been pretty easy to like outperform it. And my guess is, and obviously I'm speculating a little bit, but as interest rates move up in the life insurance world, which take a little longer, but over a long term, like I think that there's a lot of reasons to think that there's a good chance I could outproduce in terms of just the return using the MEC. And so now I've got basically my protected growth annuity minus some of those painful restrictions. Not all of them. Some of them are still there, but at least some of those that could have been frustrating are gone.
Yeah. And then the other element is we talked about using annuities for long-term care. Well, if it is a life insurance policy that has that long-term care rider, then that comes along with it. So the kind of the situation you described where it was like, well, maybe an asset-based long-term care can be a better solution than traditional long-term care, because at least I have that asset there. If I don't end up using it, then someone gets some benefit of that money. Well, that goes to a different level with the life insurance policy, because with the asset-based long-term care we talked about, don't expect much of a return on that money. 1-2%, whatever. But in the whole life policy that is dramatically overfunded to create that MEC, you're going to expect that 5+% return on those dollars. And so you have decent return and you have this long-term care rider that you can tap into that's created off of the death benefit, so
Okay,
that
and
you
that's
can get a lot more benefit out of it.
and Rod, you almost didn't hit on the next piece, which
Okay.
is the actual death benefit.
Yep.
We're like skipping right over it, right? So like if you think about it, even if all things were equal, let's just say that my mech is giving me, I'm expecting it to give me somewhere in the 5% range, and I've got a 5% annuity. Well, if all things were equal, it would make way more sense to choose the mech because it comes with a death benefit
Yep.
as well. That you're getting the exact same interest rate. So the
Mhm.
value of your money is the same. Now you just get this big death benefit that goes with it, or as you mentioned, long-term care benefit. So
Yep.
like when all things are equal, if we can come up with a situation that makes more sense and do something like this, we absolutely want to create as much value as we possibly can.
Yeah. And I think I said this, but just to be really clear, this is specific to non-qualified money. We're not going to be able to
Oh, good
do
call.
qualified money into that mech, but for non-qualified money, you're considering an annuity, you might as well consider a mech as well.
Okay, Rod, I feel like I've seen a couple of qualified mechs. Did you know that?
No,
But they were specific for long-term care.
I see.
So
Gotcha. Yeah,
that's
that
the
makes
only
sense.
time I've seen it. Life insurance that takes qualified money that's long-term, but it's like a hybrid, so that doesn't really count. Like you said, generally speaking, it's going to be non-qualified.
Yes, sir.
Whew. We've really gone down some rabbit holes here, Rod.
We did.
And I was actually thinking when we were going into it, we were like going to get into some of like the strategic ways that like our actual strategies and designs, and we didn't even get to that, right? So we're gonna have to do annuities revisited again and talk
Revisit
about
the
like
revisited.
yeah, we're going to talk about actually how we take, what would be fun? It would probably be fun for people to see like actual case design. So
Mhm.
let's just say we bring in a situation to the table, and maybe we could bring an actual client, even someone, and they could either come in live or just give us their take the information, but we could show how we actually analyze and look at this. And that could be an interesting
Yeah.
deep dive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So we've got annuity basics, annuity revisited, and we're going annuity strategies.
There you go.
All right. Okay, Rod, this has been fun. Thanks for putting it all together and delivering it. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Don't forget about the virtual summit. Go get tickets there. Okay. Thanks, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Money Insights Podcast. To learn more about the financial and business strategies discussed in this show, please visit moneyinsights.net. The views and opinions expressed on the Money Insights Podcast are not intended to be individual financial, tax, or legal advice. Always consult with the appropriate advisor before making financial decisions. And if you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This will help others find the show and learn wealth-building strategies for themselves. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.